So imagine you're a player who is considered one of the best two-way players of this era of basketball. A guy that is going to finish his career averages well over 20 points per game, over 40% shooting, and almost 40% as well from three. Not to mention on the defensive end, making a huge impact, being an all-NBA player, a multiple-time All-Star, a guy who has helped many franchises compete at the highest level. Not to mention that, but he's going to finish his career as one of the best two-way players to ever play this game. And, you know, as he gets older, naturally players decline more, but he's still playing at a pretty exceptional level. This year, he averaged 22.6 points per game, 47% from the field, 41% from three, over 1.5 steals a game. I mean, he's really done it all. And imagine this guy getting offered a 2-year, $60 million contract. Knowing the player that you still are, knowing that you still have some gas still left in the tank, would you take that offer? Or would you really bet on yourself and go out and see what you're truly worth? And if you don't know who I'm talking about, as you may or may not know, this guy's Paul George. Yes, when Paul George was in the talks with the Clippers about possibly re-signing, the first offer they gave him was a 2-year, $60 million contract. And if you don't already know, Paul George has a podcast and he discussed this topic. And the Clippers and him were trying to discuss and make a deal, but they could never really get to a deal with him. So he decided to push back and wait till the end of the season. And they finally then, after playing great, gave him a new deal, which was a 3-year deal worth over $100+ million, which was a pretty reasonable contract. However, Paul George wanted a no-trade clause in this deal because of the events that have already happened prior to him getting a lot lower of a deal. And the reality was that the Clippers really weren't trying to butt into what he wanted, and they declined that. And then he said, well, screw that. I want the 4 years. And they didn't want to do that either. They didn't want to give him 4 years. So that's when Paul George really started entertaining the idea of leaving home. And ultimately, he ended up being with the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, look, if we are being real, the 76ers will be a better basketball team than they were last season. You add in Paul George, this team for the 76ers with the Embiid, with Maxey, who is a young up-and-coming star in this league. You add on Paul George, you have 3 guys who are all dynamic in their own ways, which makes them one of the more balanced big threes we've seen in basketball for a while. However, for Paul George, you're basically leaving a situation where you were already on a team that wasn't healthy to going to play with Joel Embiid, as we all know, who is one of the most unhealthiest superstars in the league. There's something always wrong with Joel Embiid, some way, shape, or form. And this isn't really going to be any better. The only thing that you can realistically do is hope. And with the new CBA, you know, Daryl Morey, he was able to get Tyrese Maxey to not sign last year for an extension, but to do it this year so they can have more flexibility in salary to be able to sign a guy like Paul George. And luckily enough for them, that plan, it did work. They were able to get Paul George. But the reality is, for Paul George, he's 34 years old. And as you've seen throughout NBA history, despite some of the unicorns we've seen, guys, when they hit about 34 years old, they start to slowly decline in their game. And Paul George, being a player especially who is a two-way player who gives effort on both ends of the basketball court, I don't necessarily think he's going to be good for long. I think their window to really win, as we know, is going to be now. I believe they have maybe 2 years, 3 at most, that they can get the best still out of Paul George, still playing at the highest level. And luckily enough, though, in this new era of basketball, you really need defense more than ever now, because we've seen that happen this year, especially in the playoffs. But for a guy like Paul George, his shooting, his production can still be better than the player they had, like Tobias Harris, for example. He's got to be a much better upgraded comparison to what Tobias Harris was towards the end of his deal, hopefully. But the most important thing we all know for this team is health. And having a big three as well, you're not going to be as flexible when it comes to signing players. Yes, they're able to get Eric Gordon or Andre Drummond. You got Caleb Bart, who was a really great player for that Miami Heat team. You got Kelly Oubre, who was just about a 20-point per game scorer for that team. I mean, you got some pretty solid pieces, but is that enough really in this Eastern Conference? Teams like the Boston Celtics, who if they're still healthy is going to be a loaded team. You have the New York Knicks with Jalen Brunson and all those boys as well. They're going to be extremely tough to beat. You have the Milwaukee Bucks coming back as well. And let's not forget, people sleep on the Pacers, but the Pacers are going to be another team that's actually going to be really good with their young talent. Really are going to have to see what they do for sure. But one thing also I want to discuss just as well to give another perspective on this topic really was that I can understand why Paul George kind of felt the way he felt. Like, when you think about it, like, the guy, you know, regardless of what people say, he's still an All-NBA player, and he did have a relatively healthy year this year. He pretty much played every single game, and even including in the playoffs. But why give Kawhi Leonard, out of all players, the deal you gave him, but you get Paul George the deal you gave him? Like, I get that Kawhi Leonard is regarded as one of the best players of this era, but he is more of an injury risk in comparison to Paul George, especially this season. Like, he had a relatively healthy year, but he's missed more games in his time with the Clippers than Paul George has missed for that team. So why not give Kawhi Leonard a more shorter-term deal? And the reality was that they didn't want to do that, despite Paul George being the one that actually has played. Like, when Kawhi Leonard was injured that year, they made it to the Western Conference Finals. Who was still playing on the team? Paul George was still playing. He was still healthy and actually playing in that series. But you also now, despite all that, with Paul George and him controlling his narrative and going to the 76ers because he's still, in a way, betting on himself, you got to look at the consideration as well, too, man, that he really wasn't healthy throughout his time for this Clippers team. They have been inconsistent throughout the playoffs. They've had so many failures. I mean, the only accomplishment that Paul George and Kawhi Leonard have made together while both healthy was making it to the semifinals against the Denver Nuggets. But then still, in that series, they blew a 3-1 lead. So it's been nothing really but just inconsistent play and health issues. And even now with Paul George going to this Philadelphia 76ers team, there's no question really or not will he be hurt or anything, because what he's proven during his time with the Clippers in those 4 years is that he is a more injury-prone player. So you're going to a team that already has one of the most injury-prone players in Joel Embiid, and you're joining a team that really has this short window with having Embiid still and having a guy like Paul George who is 34 years old and he's getting the contract that he's getting. In a sense, yes, Paul George had every right to not take a 2-year, $60 million contract, who he wasn't even going to get paid more than James Harden, for crying out loud, which is understandable. All the other details with the deals and them not coming to a conclusion are all important, and I can understand it from the perspective from Paul George, but still, well, you got to look at it as well from this perspective that this guy has not really been healthy. Telling me out of all the seasons, this is now the first real season that he's actually been really consistent in his play. But really, what we're looking at as well, just from the bigger picture perspective, it's the CBA now that really has changed everything for the league. And we all saw with Jalen Brunson resigning his deal, he took a massive pay cut. And I think that that's really going to be that trend of guys taking pay cuts so they can get their core players to stay intact on that team, the guys who matter, or possibly getting other guys, because it's going to be really hard to still have a team that is going to be a loaded team. Like the Denver Nuggets are a team that has really struggled due to the CBA, and they even lost KCP in part of this process. For the Clippers, man, it's really going to be tough for them, but they still on paper may possibly be a playing team, but in this loaded Western Conference, if Kawhi is not healthy, they really don't have a chance. And for the 76ers, their time really to win is now. If they are all healthy, which is something that only the basketball gods you can hope for that they are, they have a chance to really compete at the highest level. But if not, then it's really just going to be a waste of time. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more basketball content each and every single week. Have a great day. Peace.